we have the privilege of bringing out a member of the NIST staff. Now, everybody here should know all these acronyms, but I'll start off with a quick overview. National Institute of Standards and Technology. They're the go-to people when it comes to all manner of standards and controls, not just in information security or information technology, in many other areas as well. So we're very lucky to get Kelley out here, Kelley Dempsey. And as you may recall, we were going to get her out during the cybersecurity symposium, but that didn't happen because the feds shut down the government and she wasn't allowed to leave her home or leave the East Coast, at least not on the Fed's dime. And Kelley's got a lot of experience. I was looking over a little bit of her bio. She started off in PC support, printers, went to system admin and a network administration. So she's one of us, one of the people that have been out there in the trenches, like Keith and other ones that have come up through the ranks in the very technical areas and are now very much interested in wanting to learn more about process and policy and controls and giving those technicians much more of our knowledge, having come up through the ranks in the area of compliance and certainly in the NIST controls. She has a number of certifications. She's very well versed in the 830 series, which is risk management. Related to that is 3739. She has a BS, Bachelor's of Science, from Management of Technical Operations with Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. That's pretty good. She graduated cum laude. Oh, wow. And of course, she's a CISSP. How many CISSPs here? All right. We need to get more CISSPs. State of California really should promote and maybe even pay for some of that. It's an excellent certification. It's much more than just the paper certification that some in other industries have. It really gives you an insight into the whole structure of information security. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Kelley Dempsey, and she's going to be your trainer today and giving you some really good information. This is an all-day affair. We'll take a reasonable break for food, and I'm not sure how the cadence will go necessarily for breaks. If you just can't wait, again, the restrooms are right out and to the right. So, Kelley?
Good morning, everyone. Okay, so thank you for that introduction, Patrick, and thanks to the state of California for inviting me out to speak and discuss our publications and how they can help the state do better risk management and implement information security and protect your information resources better and in a way that is commensurate with risk. So I want to talk first. Well, Patrick mentioned my background, so I'll just go a little bit more into that. I did start with security in 1998, and I was actually working for the Navy in Point Mugu, California, south of here. Anybody been there? I love it there. I grieve for it still. But anyway, so I just got started doing actually a military, a DoD DITSCAP certification for a big giant system that we had for the personnel support activity. And so they needed someone to do it, so they trained me, and that's kind of how I got into it, kind of by accident. But I stuck with security, and I have been doing information security since that time, since about 1998, 1999 timeframe. And then my husband was in the Navy, and so we moved to the East Coast, and I started working for NIST, and they had just come out with well, actually FISMA was coming out shortly, and at that time we actually had GISRA. Did anyone ever hear of GISRA? That was the precursor to FISMA, and we're going to talk about FISMA in a minute if you don't already know what that is. And Anyway, so that had just been made a law, so they needed someone to implement the actual program at NIST. So I started off at NIST not writing the publications on the research side, but actually implementing the publications that were coming out from the research side at NIST, as an operational unit. And so I stood up there, at that time we called it Certification and Accreditation Program. So I have been through this whole process, and like Patrick mentioned, not only in the trenches in way back when I was doing systems administration and PC support, but also in the information assurance trenches, actually doing certifications and accreditations and assessments and so on. So that's my history. So we'll just first talk a little bit about NIST. As Patrick mentioned, NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology. We were founded in 1901 as the National Bureau of Standards. We don't just do information security. We have 6 laboratories, and they're quite varied. There's chemistry, there's biology, there's building and fire research. They do the standards for bulletproof vests, for how fireproof mattresses have to be. They've got a whole building where they literally set mattresses on fire and test mattresses and other things that are supposed to be fire resistant. So there's a lot of things going on at NIST. We have a nanotechnology lab. We actually have a nuclear reactor at NIST, a small one. So check out our website there, www.nist.gov. There's a lot of stuff going on at NIST. But as you can see, we're part of the Department of Commerce. So our mission is to promote U.S. Innovation and business and competitiveness. So my division is the Computer Security Division. And I should mention, and this might not be so important for the state, but we are a non-regulatory organization. So we're putting out this guidance, but it's not, as far as it's coming from NIST, it's not really a policy. So it's other federal organizations that make it a policy. So Computer Security Division puts out 3 different types of publications. We have the Federal Information Processing Standards, and those were, do we not have the FISMA slide here? Okay, yeah, it's coming up. FISMA is the law, of course, the Federal Information Security Management Act, a law enacted by Congress, and it has made the FIPS mandatory for implementation for federal organizations. And then I understand from Patrick that the state of California has then also made that a policy to adopt whatever the federal standards are. So we have the FIPS. The FIPS are signed by the Secretary of Commerce, and they go through a much more rigorous approval process than our special publications. And the special publications are the largest amount of we put out the most special publications of anything. They do provide guidance on various information technology, security implementations, and not just for the risk management process, but also there's a lot of technical publications. There's there's a lot on cryptography, there's RFID, there's wireless, there's all kinds of publications out there, and we'll talk a little bit about those later when we get to the 837 presentation. But I think we have roughly on the order of, we're up in the 160s, 160 different special publications, and they're all related to information security implementations of some kind or another. So take a look out there at csrc.nist.gov, and you can see what's out there. If there's something that will help you in whatever you're trying to do or implement in a secure way, then they're all out there free for your use. And then we have our little NIST interagency reports, or NISTers, and they're sort of a catch-all. They're maybe not quite ready for prime time in a special publication, or maybe they're so laser focused on a specific technology or something like along those lines that we just put them in a NIST IR. And so I don't want to imply that they're less important or less, good than the special publications, but they're out there, and there's lots of them too. So go ahead and take a look at what's out there and see if there's something that could help you. So the other thing that goes along with our publications is we have a public comment process. Does anyone know about the NIST public comment process? Has anyone ever commented? Patrick, yay. So every single one of those publications that I mentioned, and the FIPS as well, and I think the NIST IR is also, everything goes through a public comment process. So we post the publication as an initial public draft. And everyone basically in the world is invited to go ahead and read through it and comment on it. And we take every one of those comments seriously. And I mean, we get a few crackpot comments, but for the most part, like 99% of the comments we get are helpful, well thought out comments that really help make our publications better, because you know, we might be subject matter experts, and we have a team of people working on a lot of these posts, but we can't think of everything. And not only can we not think of everything, but you know how it is when you're close to something, you think you've explained it in a way that makes sense, but instead we get all these comments like, what the heck are you people talking about? So the public comments really do help us, and they make the publications better. And I don't want anyone to think if they take the time to comment that they'd be wasting their time, because we really look at every single comment and give every single comment equal consideration. So I invite everyone to participate in the public comment process, and we do like to hear from, we do hear from a wide range of types of people in, you know, academia and in private industry, at states, local governments, even international folks, governments, and we even have a couple of international governments that look into our process and have based their own processes on our process. So that's always nice. But in any case, if you're interested and you want to receive notifications of new drafts that are being posted, you can sign up and get notifications. You're not going to be spammed with a bunch of stuff. It's usually just maybe 1 or 2 messages a month at the most, depending on what's being released. And then I also want to mention that there may be 1 or more drafts of an individual publication. So what we do is we put out the initial public draft, we get all the comments in, and then we go through them and adjudicate them all and make changes to the publication. If we made a lot of changes, if the publication from the initial public draft is significantly different from that initial public draft, then we would do a second public draft and give people another crack at it if we feel that the changes were so significant that we want to get another round of public comments. So that happens quite a bit, that we have a second public draft, and occasionally you might even see a third one. So we do the drafts are all there at that link. And also the length of public comment periods vary depending on usually the initial public draft, especially if it's a brand new publication that's out for the very first time and not a revision. Usually we'll have quite a long, like 2 or 3 month public comment period, so everyone really has a chance to dive in and see what's in there and make their comments. And then when we go to a second public draft, or if it's a revision of a pub, then we might only have maybe 4 weeks for the initial. And then if there's a second public draft, we might only have 2 or 3 weeks. So it really depends, and it also depends on how many changes were made and how much of a time crunch we're in. So there's no standard there, so I just wanted to make everyone aware of that. And then we do interact with other organizations, as you can see here. Where I have asterisks, that's where NIST has been the lead. So this is just a little, you know, we're not, I just have this slide in there to let everyone know we're not in some ivory tower in a vacuum. You know, we're out there interacting with other organizations, and we're on a lot of interagency working groups, and so and we do also participate in various. We have people on. These are just the ones I could think of off the top of my head. There's a lot of other international standards organizations that we do participate in. So let's talk about FISMA and NIST. So I mentioned earlier, FISMA is a law enacted by Congress, the Federal Information Security Management Act, part of the E-Government Act of 2002, and it applies to federal organizations and their contractors. And it does require, and this is what I think sums up FISMA in a nutshell: information security protections commensurate with the risk and magnitude of harm. That, in my opinion, that's all you really need to know about FISMA. That's what it wants you to do. That's the goal of it. It's not compliance. You know, if you go through our process and you implement security commensurate with risk, in my view, you're automatically going to be compliant. So the goal is not compliance. The goal is to secure our systems and our information commensurate with risk. And I think that was the intent of FISMA, and that is certainly our intent with the publications that we have written. So, you know, sometimes people, we have some detractors, if you can imagine that say this is a paperwork exercise and you know it's not useful but it's just like with school or anything else. You get out of it what you put into it. If you make it a paperwork exercise, it's a paperwork exercise. But if you actually use the process in the way it was intended, then you do get good results. And I know this from having done it at NIST. Again, operationally, we started out with very few controls in place, and they had just put a firewall in place when I got there in 2001, and from there, we implemented all the defense in depth and all the different controls, and great improvements were made and strides were made in our the level of security that we had there. And so again, if you use the process how it's intended and you actually put your heart into it and do it as it's intended, you are going to get good results and you are going to have better security for your information that is commensurate with risk. And the FISMA is actually what required NIST to develop the standards and guidelines that we've been developing, like 53 and 37 and 39 and the pubs that we're going to talk about today. So that happens quite a bit. We get laws will be written or various things will here's another slide where we get other direction from Office of Management and Budget, memos, executive orders, Homeland Security, presidential directives. They will come out and they will mandate that NIST write some kind of guidance for something. It's not always necessarily related to risk management. Recently, has anyone heard of the executive order, I think it's 13636 on the critical infrastructure framework? So that came out, I guess, last February or March, February, thank you. And that directed NIST to write a risk management framework for critical infrastructure, so not for federal organizations, but for privately owned critical infrastructure. And so we've all been hard at work doing that. But in any case, that's just an example of how an executive order or a policy from OMB might come out and direct NIST to write some guidance. So that's what we do. Any questions so far about any of that? And by the way, I'm a very informal person, so if you have a question, don't wait. Just go ahead and shout it out or raise your hand. No, that's fine. So here's a list of the standards and guidelines that directly apply to risk management. Again, as I mentioned earlier, there's 160 something, so there's many, many more publications than this, but these are the ones that I think directly apply to risk management. And we're going to talk about each of these at least a little bit today, not in this presentation, but when we do the presentation on 837, which will probably be after lunch, we're going to talk about each one of these. Now, when I mentioned that we collaborated with other organizations and we worked on a lot of working groups, interagency working groups, the publications you see here in bold, and again, this isn't so important for you at the state level, but at the federal level, we had the Department of Defense. As I mentioned, I had done a DITSCAP certification, and so the Department of Defense was using a different process than the civilian side of the government, and so this went on for several years, and then so our team leader, the FISMA team lead at NIST, is Dr. Ron Ross. He's my immediate supervisor. Has anyone heard of Ron? Patrick, thank you. Okay. But anyway, Ron is our leader, and he interacts a lot with the leaders of other organizations, and so he was talking with some of the DoD folks and some of the intelligence community folks, and they were all they were asking Ron, how can we improve, DIACAP at that time, and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, one thing led to another, and they decided we would all come together and we would have a joint transformation initiative, and that's what they called it. And so we got a task force together, an interagency working group with the intelligence folks, with us at NIST and a couple other civilian agencies, and also the DoD folks. And we came up with the 5 pubs that are bolded here are the Joint Task Force pubs. So those are publications that if you go to anywhere in the federal government now, everyone should be using the same process based on those 5 publications, all of which we're going to talk about today. So this is just a little slide. I'm sure we all know that risk, we're all security professionals, so we know that risk can never be completely eliminated, so we have to manage it. And managing it doesn't mean fixing every single thing, and it also doesn't mean fixing, not fixing anything. So you find that balance. We seek to find that balance, and that's security commensurate with risk. So, and this is just a little quote I like from Stephen Hawking. The most important thing is having knowledge of what the risks are. So if you sit there thinking, yeah, I'm good, I know, but you really need to know. So you really have to spend the time, do your risk assessment, and find out really what your risks are. So that's, not knowing is much worse than knowing. Right. Okay, so some definitions here. Information security, protection of security from unauthorized access use, blah, blah, blah. I think we all know when we want to provide, of course, our security objectives are confidentiality, integrity, and availability. We want to preserve those objectives. A threat, of course, any circumstance or event that seeks to adversely affect us and our operations. And this is Ron's. Operations, assets, individuals, other organizations, or the nation. So if you read the NIST pubs, you're going to see that phrase repeated over and over. But that's what we want to protect, and threats, of course, are trying to adversely affect those things. And then, of course, risk is a measure of the extent to which an entity is threatened, and it is a function of impacts and likelihoods. So we're going to go through all of that when we go through 830, the risk assessment guidance. So in the past, if we did risk management at all, everyone was way down. So we're kind of jumping into 839 now. So, and I should have mentioned earlier that 839 is risk management at all levels of the organization, and so we're gonna go into that. But in the past, we did have organizations managing information security. If they were doing it all, they were way down at the system level. They were all in their little information system silos, doing their own little things, and only concerned about their own systems. And it turns out, a given system can have a big effect on the entire organization or an entire mission. So we wanted to raise it up a notch and make sure that we were looking at the big picture and not just down at the tactical system level, but get the whole organization involved and at all levels of the organization. Right, and the very last bullet's important. The focus seemed to be on vulnerability management rather than actually risk management. So we want to move away from that with 839. And we tried in 39 to recognize that we did have all these complex relationships between systems and missions and the organization as a whole. And so we tried to provide a consistent way to manage that risk throughout the entire organization at all three levels, which we'll have a slide on the levels hopefully coming up soon. A couple more slides. A little more on 39. We tried to provide a strong basis for reciprocal acceptance of authorization decisions, and so that's also part of why we wanted the Joint Task Force to come together with DoD and the intelligence community so that we were all using the same process. So if we needed to share information, we could say, here's my authorization and all my evidence from my assessments and how we've come to arrive at authorizing the system to operate, and now you should accept this because you use the same process I do. So we can all hopefully feel like we can reciprocate because we've all used the same process. We want to establish an organization-wide risk management strategy. So again, we're not stovepipe, we're not in silos. We're doing the same thing throughout the organization. And of course we need, we've all been to classes where they tell us, security starts at the top, you have to get your senior managers involved, and that is so true. And is that, does that happen all the time? I know it doesn't at the federal government, so we still are hearing stories about, oh, my senior manager will just sign off on whatever I tell him to, and so we don't really want that. We want the senior managers to be involved and really have at least some idea of what's happening and with risk and making actual decisions about it, because the buck should stop with them, really, shouldn't it?
Question.
Yes, sir.
How can you share with us what some of the challenges that you've seen and faced in regards to involving senior management in security type discussions?
Well, I think one of the problems is a lot of times the senior management they're not security professionals. So sometimes it's hard. So I think one of the tricks is to explain things to them, in a way that is clear, that they can understand the risks and what the returns might be if you do thus and so, or if you implement this or you don't implement this, and also we're going to talk about risk tolerance, so they need to be making these decisions, and sometimes they're not security professionals. A lot of times they're not, but maybe if you're lucky, they're at least technical, or they've been, they have been down in the trenches and they've risen up to be the CIO or whatever it is. But I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges. And then of course time, they're very busy people, and even if I know we've had a lot of discussions and maybe a little bit of dirty laundry here, but we wanted them to go to a 4-hour training class, and this was at NIST a couple of years ago, and no, it's 4 hours is too much. They don't have time for that. They can only have 1 hour of training. So things along those are some of the challenges that we've faced, I think, mostly based on time and background as far as knowledge of actual information security. Do you have anything? Have you found anything?
I think the biggest thing would be some of the challenges that my organization has faced is reactionary type thinking.
Excellent point. Right, let's wait for something to happen. Don't be proactive.
Exactly.
Right, and that's a great point. And this whole process, again, if you go through the process and are somewhat accurate with it, hopefully that you can minimize some of that, the need to react, and at least have processes in place so that the reaction isn't as crazy if you do have to react. So that's a great point. Thank you. Anybody else want to share horror stories? Okay. So I mentioned a second ago the risk executive function. So this is Ron called it a function. So it's more like a group or an entity that is going to decide how much risk can our organization tolerate? What can we really live with? Are we, we get into some examples in a little bit, but if you're a DoD organization, you probably have a very, very low risk tolerance. You don't want to tolerate much risk at all. But maybe if you're the Department of Education, not that it's not important, but as far as risk, you're not dealing with the impacts aren't as great, and so maybe your risk tolerance then is higher. And so that's something that the risk executive function needs to decide and make known to the rest of the organization. And then of course we want to link all risk management activities at all 3 tiers through that risk executive function. So our target audience is pretty much everybody that's involved with information risk management, anyone involved with oversight, mission business functions, security oversight, blah blah. You can see the slide. This is our target audience. So and also don't forget your acquisitions people. Who's in charge of writing proposals to buy stuff or to perhaps get software developed or something like that. So it's very important that these people are involved and understand the risk management process, because when do we want to start thinking about security in our information products? At the beginning. Right, so, and that's another thing I'll talk about and get into later. We've all as security professionals talked about baking it in. Let's bake it in. How often are we seeing that happen? I'd still have to go with rarely, frankly, in a lot of cases. So we're still trying to hammer that whole idea of security from the top down and baking it in. And I think we could make a lot of progress if we could move forward with that. But in any case, where are we? Right, individuals. So it is very important that that people that are involved with acquisitions have knowledge of this process, as well as system design and so on, and of course your security assessors. So the objectives of 839, again, bringing those senior leaders in, getting them to recognize the importance of managing risk, establishing governance structures, and that's what the risk executive function would do, establishing management of risk across all 3 tiers, and then of course fostering understanding of risk and how it affects mission business processes. So each organization has various, either maybe only one single mission, or maybe several missions that they're trying to accomplish, and so we need to understand how things are affecting those missions. So some key elements in 839, assigning risk management responsibilities to senior leaders. So we have some pretty detailed information in there of how you can work to that goal and what responsibilities the senior leaders need to have. Recognition by those senior leaders about the risk to operations, just having them have some awareness of it, establishing risk tolerance, and that I mentioned that earlier, providing guidance on how this risk tolerance might impact our decisions. So when we find out, we do our risk assessment and we find out we have some risk here, what do we do? The risk tolerance that they've established is going to help us make that determination what we should do. And of course, we really like to see those senior leaders be accountable for the decisions they make. So, you know, those are the key elements of 839. So here's our tiers. We have the organizational tier on top, the governance. They're putting out policies. The risk executive function is living up there, and they're putting out policies. They're making decisions about what our organizational risk tolerance is. They are letting us know at the lower tiers what those decisions are and how we should apply those at the other levels. And of course, that is our strategic focus as we move up. And then in the middle, we have tier 2, the mission business process tier. So if you are the chief financial officer, you probably have multiple. I mean, your mission is you know, to get people paid, to pay the organization's bills, to make purchases and all of those, and maybe even take in money. So you probably have numerous systems underneath you that are going to be taking care of those things, but it all adds up to one single mission. And so the you know, that's what I mean by mission. You know, what is the mission of the organization and what systems are living under there to support that mission here at the system level. And of course we have, as we go lower, we go from strategic to tactical, and I don't have, one of the other slides we have has arrows going up and down, but we do want information flowing up and down. So we want risk information from operating systems to be flowing up so that the senior leaders and the people at the mission business process level understand what the risks from our systems are so that they can look at it in an aggregated way, because they're up here and they're at the organizational level. So, you know, maybe you have the CIO of the state of California here, and that person needs to know about the systems and risks that affect all the missions that the state is in charge of. So, you know, so that's a big job. But the point is that information needs to flow upward, and then the risk management decisions and the risk tolerance decisions need to be flowing downward so that everybody knows what's going on. So we need to have our two-way information flow here on the pyramid. And then just so 39 covers all 3 tiers really, but it's kind of more focused on tiers 1 and 2 because we have 837 is the risk management framework to help us out at the system level. But as far as communications and who needs to know what, you know, again, we do need to have that two-way information flow. Does that make sense to everybody? So the 3-tiered approach, addressing risk in the context of critical mission business functions, which I kind of already said, fosters a climate where information security risk is considered in all of these aspects and designs of processes, designs of security architecture. So again, baking it in. And our system development lifecycle processes, again, baking it in and doing risk management throughout the entire lifecycle of the system. So, and of course we want to facilitate understanding of how risk affects those mission business processes, which again is why we have to have that up and down flow of information. So we're going to start by quickly talking about the organization level, the top tier, and what is going on there. The organizational tier, where they're implementing risk framing by providing context to all risk management activities within the organization. So again, that's the risk executive function telling us what is our risk tolerance, what are our policies, and so they're providing that government structure. So I think we've been over that enough. Here's just a quick governance definition. So this is not particular to information security. This is just a general definition of governance. You know, the set of responsibilities and practices exercised by those responsible. So again, we see that word responsible. We have the senior leaders at the organization level hopefully being responsible for the decisions and what is happening at the lower levels. What are the governance goals? Providing that strategic direction, making sure we meet our mission objectives. I mean, the goal is that to if you're the CFO, again, pay our people, you know, buy stuff that we need and pay those bills. So we want to make sure that happens and that our systems that we're using to make that happen are secure and we're not getting in any trouble there. And also we want to tell if risks are being managed appropriately and verify that resources are used responsibly. So that's the other thing about our process. One of the goals that the overall process seeks to achieve is to use resources effectively and not be repeating work. So we'll get into some of that later. So what desired outcomes do we have of managing risk at the organizational level? We want to align those decisions with the mission business functions. Like I said, we need a tie in there. I mentioned at the very beginning of the discussion that if we had risk management at all, it was usually down at the system level. So we want to bring that up a couple of levels. Executing risk management processes to frame, assess, respond, and monitor the risk. And those are actually the steps in the risk management process: frame, assess, respond, and monitor. We'll get to that in a minute. And again, the idea of allocating risk management resources effectively. So if you don't know what the risks are across the organization, you can't decide what is my priority. So I only have X number of dollars. So obviously I want to fix the most serious problems first. And so you have to understand the aggregate situation across the whole organization before you can really make those determinations of how to effectively use your resources and maybe even centrally manage things so you're only doing it one time and not having the same thing across multiple organizations. And sorry, when I use organization, we have this definition in our pubs, but when I say organization, I might mean the state of California or I might mean, you know, the franchise tax board. So, you know, organization is a catch-all word and it could be at any level, so hopefully that's not confusing to anyone. But anyway, we want to measure, monitor, and report risk management performance. Right, so we have to, again, that flow of information. So what did we find out during our risk management activities and let everybody know how that's been going so that we can tell if we've achieved our objectives, if we're getting better, do we need to make some changes to our process, things along those lines, and of course delivering value by optimizing those investments. Okay, senior leaders in the risk executive function, what are they determining? Again, the types of risk management decisions that are going to be made up at that level. The types of risk management decisions that affect the whole organization. So that's why they need to be engaged and understand what's going on with risk across the organization, because they're going to be, if there's some type of a risk then they need to make decisions about it and it's affecting the entire organization, then they need to have a lot of information so that they can make good decisions. And then they would also decide what decisions can be delegated. So, you know, they actually are busy people, and I didn't mean to malign them when I said that. They do have a lot of responsibilities and things to do. So some things they do need to delegate, and so they can make that decision at the governance level about what they're going to reserve for themselves to decide and what they're going to delegate down to lower tier organizations. And then how are we going to communicate up and down? You know, who's going to communicate to who's going to report to us, how often, those sorts of communication decisions. And so we hope that the senior leaders in the risk executive function can make those determinations for the organization. So we have three types of governance models. This is kind of basic stuff: centralized, decentralized, and hybrid. Of course, centralized is where you have the authority at one concentrated at one place, and they are making the majority of the decisions, and you do, as you can see there, need to have a strong, well-informed central leadership, and then of course you have less autonomy. The lower tier organizations are just kind of have to do what they're told, and maybe get some say or not, it depends. Decentralized is when they delegate out the authority, so that's when you kind of get into your silos maybe, and then maybe that works for some organizations. It really depends, but you do have increased effectiveness with strong risk information sharing policies. You need that if you're going to have decentralized governance model. And then, then we have the hybrid model where you have a little bit of this and a little bit of that. Some things are centralized, some decisions being made are made at the centralized upper level, and then other ones are delegated down. So what do we think we have in California? Do we have a hybrid governance model for information security here? Is that what we would say? That's probably the norm, more so than anything, than one or the other. So, and these are all, of course, this is an overview. I'm just trying to run through this quickly. Obviously, we have a whole publication with a lot more information in there that I encourage. Who has read 839? Anybody? A few people? Patrick? A few people? All right. So anyway, seriously, it's I say it's that thick, and it is, but it's not really that, it's not that long. So I would encourage everyone to at least read through it once. The risk executive function, the functional role that provides comprehensive organization-wide approach to risk management. I think we've been over that. Serves as a risk management resource for all stakeholders. So you want the risk executive function to be knowledgeable and engaged and have their situational awareness, because the idea is for system owners and authorizing officials to come to them, especially when they have something that is going to affect the whole organization. And so it's important that they are a resource for all stakeholders. And hopefully we do see on the risk executive function a mix of skills. So we don't just have super techie people or only administrative people. We want to get a mix of skills on there. And then it's up to the organization to decide how they want to implement the risk executive function. They can just have a single group. They can have an interagency working group, or of made up of different people from different organizations throughout the larger organization. So it's whatever's going to work. We don't mandate or dictate exactly how the risk executive function has to look. We just give you some ideas of what they should do, and then each organization gets to decide for themselves how they want to implement that. So at Tier 1, the risk management strategy, that is a key output of the risk framing component. What is our risk management strategy for our organization? When we do the risk framing step, that's one of the things we decide what is our strategy for our the organizational risk management. It tells us how our organizational risk will be assessed, responded to, and monitored, which are the other 3 steps. Again, we're going to get to this, but framing, assessment, response, and monitoring. And then the strategy, has to include these things so that, again, we all know where we stand. What is our risk tolerance? What risk assessment methodologies are we going to use? And we're going to talk about those later. What are our risk response strategies? So if we have a risk we need to respond to, what are we going to do? What are our strategies there? And again, as the gentleman mentioned, hopefully things like this, having these things done and in policy and made known to everyone, hopefully that will help stave off some reactionary situations and move more into the proactive state. And of course, our approach is for ongoing risk monitoring, and we're going to see a repeated theme with monitoring as we go on throughout the day. Is everybody with me still? Does everyone have coffee? Okay. Or something? Caffeine of some kind? All right, risk tolerance. That is the level of risk or degree of uncertainty that is acceptable to the organization. So uncertainty is a big part of that you have to factor into risk and risk assessment, because even though I said before that you need to have knowledge and that if you don't know, not knowing is worse, let's face it, there's always going to be things we don't know about with respect to risk. So recognizing that and understanding that is part of knowledge in itself. What are the key elements of the strategy, and what the effects that risk tolerance will have, the nature and extent of risk management oversight, the extent and rigor of risk assessments. So when we talk about risk assessments, you can dive pretty deeply into it, or you can stay a little bit on the surface, or just how rigorous are we going to make those risk assessments. And then strategies again for responding. So these are things that risk tolerance affects or has an effect on. So here's a little bit more about risk tolerance with regard to threats. So here's some examples. Organizations that are more risk tolerant, maybe they're only going to address threats that have already been exploited. So we know this is going to happen. It's already happened over here at this other organization. So if we're more risk tolerant, we're tolerant of risk. So we're not going to get too worked up about what might happen. We're only going to deal with things that actually have happened at other organizations. Now, if you're a less risk tolerant organization, then you're going to be looking at this might happen, this could happen, and this would be very bad. The impact would be high. So we're going to go ahead and address that. With regard to risk response, if you're a more risk tolerant organization, maybe you don't require very much assurance on what the effectiveness is of your controls, and you can accept more risk rather than mitigating it. So when you do find out what your risks are, maybe you're not going to use resources to mitigate those risks because you have a high risk tolerance, so you can just maybe you can accept some of those risks rather than spending the money to mitigate them. Now, if you're less risk tolerant, then you might need extra assurance, you might need to do more in-depth risk assessments, and you probably are going to do more mitigation and less accepting as far as your risk responses with regard to how much risk you can tolerate. And the degree of risk tolerance is indicative of the organizational culture. So again, I'll use the DoD example. They're very risk averse. So their culture is to be risk averse. And so the degree of risk tolerance there is affected by that. And sometimes we can even, we can lose track of I don't want to say lose track of reality, but we might think worse things are there are more threats or there's more risk than really there is. So we want to be careful of our organizational culture, and the opposite way too. If we're a risk tolerant organization, we don't want to be laissez-faire about it and cavalier. We want to make sure that we really are addressing the risks that are there and making sure that we're not kidding ourselves about it. And again, it's influenced subjectively by those senior leaders. So again, if you have a senior leader that's from a DoD background, they might be all gung-ho, we're going to do everything, we're going to mitigate everything. But if the person came from managing the public libraries, then maybe they're not as intense about it. And so your whole organization is going to be influenced by those things. So again, hopefully having a well-rounded risk executive function and that they can make things be more closer to actual reality and less influenced by subjective things from people's past or the organization's past. Right, so less risk-tolerant organizations may sacrifice needed mission capability. So again, if you can't tolerate very much risk, then maybe there's just some things you're just not going to do. We're not going to do that. We can't tolerate the risk, so we're going to not do that as part of our mission. And then on the other side, more risk-tolerant organizations may minimize the risk. Okay, so I kind of already said that, and set themselves up for future failure. And so again, we need that balance to be struck. We go through our risk management process, and we exercise our due diligence, and hopefully we come out on the other end with something that's appropriate. Okay, we're moving on to Tier 2. Is everybody okay? What time is it? Yeah. Okay, so Tier 2, we have our mission business process level. And that's where we identify and establish risk-aware mission business processes. So again, we're not at the system level, we're in between, and we're looking at an entire mission and what are the systems that support that mission. And the senior leaders there, they need to understand what the threat sources and threat events that may affect that entire process, not just a single system. And what are the potential adverse impacts if our confidentiality, integrity, or availability is compromised. And then how resilient do we want our systems that are supporting that process to be? So that's where we start getting into, when we start getting into our process and we try to determine what our impact, our system impact is and our mission impact, then we can decide how resilient we need our systems to be as far as availability and the ability to, a system to continue to operate under adverse circumstances. So, has anyone heard of enterprise architecture? It's big, and so some people have. It's kind of big in the federal government. We have a whole federal enterprise architecture group, and they're not just concerned with security, but in any case, it is a management practice that connects investments to measurable performance improvements. So again, not just specific to security, but what are we getting? We're making this investment. Are we getting back from it what we really need? And to measure that with actual metrics so that we can tell. And that's, what are you getting for your money? That's basically what the first bullet there means. It does apply a disciplined and structured approach for managing IT assets and underlying infrastructure. And so you can see there, if you standardize, you gain efficiency. If you consolidate, it's more cost effective, and you can optimize that by using common language. So these are just enterprise architecture principles. And then of course, for the federal enterprise architecture, if you're interested, there's the link. So I just wanted to bring that up. I don't know if you guys implement that here. But here's another slide on, so this is actually information security architecture. So that has to be integrated into the enterprise architecture so that you are addressing your system resilience and security capabilities within the confines of the enterprise architecture that hopefully is already established. And it does help ensure mission business process driven information security requirements are consistently and cost effectively implemented. So hopefully if everything goes well, that actually does happen. And then we have some traceability here. Strategic goals traceable to mission business protection needs that are traceable to actual security solutions and controls. So we have a flow, or sometimes I've seen it called a security traceability matrix, those sorts of things. And we see this is implemented at tier 2, but it does cut across all 3 tiers, obviously. So this is just a graphic from 839 that just kind of shows, our whole, up at the tier 1, we had the organization risk management strategy. That's flowing down to our mission business process level. And that decisions made there is informing our enterprise architecture and our security architecture, which then flows down and informs what we're doing down at our system level and in our environments of operation. So here we are at tier 3, down at our little system level. So we have risk management activities occurring there and being integrated into the system development lifecycle. And we'll learn later in 837 that we have integrated the system development lifecycle into all the steps in there at the system level. Integrating risk management integrating risk management into the SDLC is the most cost-effective way to secure our systems. Again, we want to bake it in, and we start off developing a new system. We're at the initiation phase of the system development lifecycle. That's when we better start thinking about security and what are the security requirements for that system going to be, what types of information is it going to process, determine those impact levels. You already want to start thinking about selecting your security controls already at the initiation phase. So that's that little lecture. Risk management decisions at each SDL phase have an effect on subsequent phases. Of course they do. So as you move along, whatever you decide at the initiation phase, you might find out that was, maybe you have to regroup and make a different decision as you move on to the development and acquisition phase and so on. But you can be cognizant of that. And of course, I already mentioned specific guidelines for the risk management system level. We'll go into that in depth in 37. So here in 39, back to 39, we have our 4 components of risk management that I already mentioned: framing, assessing, responding, and monitoring. So we're going to talk briefly about each one of those. And in framing risk, you're establishing that risk context. What is my strategy? That's the output of the risk framing step is your risk management strategy. And here's some things you identified during your risk frame. What are we making assumptions about? And that's important to know. Again, going to uncertainty. What have we assumed? And we have to note down what we've assumed and what assumptions we've made, because that might come back to haunt us later. So it's important to know what happened there, so we're not going, what did we say back then? We don't know. So what are our constraints? Do we have resource constraints? Do we have skill level restraints? Do we have operational constraints? I don't know. It's important to find out what our constraints are during the framing step. And again, what is our risk tolerance? Hopefully our risk executive function has already told us that, but we need to be taking that into consideration during this step. And what priorities and trade-offs do we have? And again, in 39, you can find out a lot more detail about all of that. So that's the framing step. And then in the assess step is where we actually go ahead and assess our risk. And again, we're doing that. And when we get to 830, which is going to be next, we assess risk at all three levels. So and there's different, it's a little bit different at each level, but we are looking at risk and assessing risk at the governance, mission, business, and system levels. And so risk assessments, of course, identify threats and vulnerabilities, and then what is the potential harm or impact, and what is the likelihood of that occurring. So that's basically, that's risk assessment in a nutshell across the board of any risk assessment that you ever do, whether it's about information security or other aspects of your lives or of your organization. But anyway, the end result is a determination of risk, again, the degree of harm and the likelihood of occurrence. So we'll get into risk assessment deeply in the next session. And then once we know what our risks are, so we've got our output of the risk assessment, we don't just sit there and stare at it, we have to make some kind of a response. And so when we respond, we look at different, sometimes maybe it's obvious how we need to respond, but other times there might be, most of the time, there's a bigger gray area of what we're going to do for our response. So we develop some alternative courses of action. Maybe we have 3 or 4 choices, and then we, of course, evaluate those. How is this going to work? What are the effects of this? Blah, blah, blah. And then we determine which is most appropriate, and then we implement that response. So, and then of course, here's our potential risk responses. And sometimes we just accept the risk. We know, we found out, now we have our knowledge, we're aware that this is a problem, but we're just gonna accept this risk. Maybe we're accepting it only temporarily until we can find some resources to do some mitigation, or maybe we're just gonna keep an eye on it, and it's just something we have to live with and just at least know about. Sometimes we're going to mitigate the risk. We're going to go ahead and put some new controls in place or make some changes to our processes, something along those lines that are going to decrease that risk and make it less risky. Sometimes we might reject the risk. I mentioned that earlier. Something comes up, we want to add some functionality to a system, and we do a risk assessment, and it's like, whoa, that is too big of a risk. We're not going to do that. We're rejecting it completely. And or you might be able to share and transfer risk with another organization. You might be able to maybe, in government that maybe doesn't work as well as in private industry, but you can also, I know industry they can buy insurance against information security risks, and in the government and state and federal governments we can't really do that. So, but anyway, right? Yeah, you have to watch out if you share risk with another organization that we don't get into. No, you said you were going to do that. So anytime you're going to share risk, you better have some well laid out responsibilities for each sharing side. So that's response to risk. Then once we know what our risks are and we have done our risk assessments and maybe we've done some mitigations, maybe we've done some acceptance, a little both, whatever. Now we need to keep an eye on that. And not only do we keep an eye on what we already found out about, but we look for new risks that have popped up as we monitor. And so when we monitor risk, we are describing how compliance is verified, how our ongoing effectiveness of risk response is determined. So what tools are we using? What methodologies are we using to look at that? And we want to monitor that risk over time. Verifying that our response, so if we decided to respond to something, and so you're up here at the risk executive function, and they say, you know, go forth and implement this mitigation technique, well, someone needs to go back and make sure that that actually happened and test that implementation and make sure that it actually was effective. And of course, identifying any changes to the system that are going to impact risk. And to the mission business process and organizational level as well, actually. I should probably change that. So that's monitoring risk. And again, we're going to hear monitoring in almost every, at the end of almost every publication, we see something about monitoring. And so I just want to say now that we don't mean, again, we're not looking for separate silos of monitoring. We're not having a group monitoring risk over here and monitoring, control implementations or assessments over here and monitoring configuration management processes over here. We want one big monitoring program, going on as part of your continuous monitoring strategy. We'll see that later in the 837 discussion. So here's just a diagram of that, of what we just talked about, framing, assessing, responding, and monitoring. And we see that, everything is flowing back and forth from the frame. You keep looking to the frame. What were my assumptions? What were my constraints? What was my strategy? Remember that? And so as you go through these other 3 steps, you look back to the frame and you can see we have all the bidirectional arrows. So that's the process diagram. Information flow going in all directions. Okay, so in 39, we have, for each one of those 4 steps that we just talked about, there's tasks within each step. So it's laid out in this way. We have, for each of the 4 steps, we have inputs and preconditions, describing what you need before you start that step. What do I need to start with? What information do I need to begin? And then, and what preconditions might I have to take into account? And then what activities take place. So within each step, there's several tasks that need to happen. And so it lays those out. Those are the actual activities, the task name, the task number and description, and any supplemental guidance about the task. And then outputs and post conditions. So when you're done with that task or step, what is coming out? What is my output? And especially when you go from framing to assessment, the output of the framing step is going to be an input to the assessment step. And the output of the assessment step is going to be input to the response step, and so on. So anyway, that type of information is all noted down in 39. So here we have the tasks, and I didn't want to take the time to go individually over each task, but we can see that in the framing step we have 4 tasks to do. We already talked about these. What are our risk assumptions? What are our constraints? What is our risk tolerance? And what are our priorities and trade-offs? So those are, figuring all of that out is basically the first, the framing step, and those 4 tasks. Then in the assessment step, we have 2 tasks, actually determine the threats and vulnerabilities, and then the risk determination is determining the likelihoods and impacts. So seems so simple, right? And then we move on to the risk response tasks. We see 4 tasks there. We identify what our risk response, again, I kind of went over this already, the alternative courses of action, evaluating those courses, deciding on what's appropriate, and then implementing that. And then finally, in the monitoring step, we develop a risk monitoring strategy for our ongoing monitoring of the risk, and then we actually do the monitoring of the risk. So that is 839 in a really fast nutshell. At the end of all the presentations, I have this contact information, and let me say that I get questions all the time. If you have comments, feel free to send them to seccert@nist.gov, and you're going to get a response pretty quickly from usually me, but if for some reason I'm not available, then either Arnold or Ron will respond to you. And we pride ourselves on providing responses. We don't want people out there swinging in the wind wondering what the heck they're supposed to do. And so we do respond pretty quickly to any questions that we get. So as you move along through the process, if you have questions, feel free to email us at any time.